Guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren, ich begrüße Sie zur Schwarze Katze Theologie. Letztes Mal habe ich einen Punkt gemacht, das ich heute besser erklären möchte. Hello everyone and welcome to Black Cat Theology. In German, I just said that last time I made a point that I would like to explain better this time, today. Remember that last time we were discussing these two versions of the philosophy of Erignis that Heidegger gives. At least they seem to be two very different versions. On the one hand, we looked at the philosophy of Erignis that Heidegger sketches in some of the entries from 1933 in the Schwarze Hefte, the Black Notebooks. And on the other hand, we looked at later descriptions that Heidegger gives of Erignis, or this non-metaphysical event of being and thinking about it. Descriptions that he gives, for example, in the letter on humanism, in the 40s and 47, I believe, and then the Beiträge zur Philosophie throughout the 30s, that's the contributions to philosophy. And rhetorically, it seems that Heidegger is setting forth two very different views of Erignis. What I argued last time is that this is not so, because philosophically, they really are come down to this fundamentally the same position, and they are vulnerable to the same objection. Now, I want to clarify that point today. I want to start with that. And then the second thing I want to do is to develop this more Christological point that I mentioned at the end of the last session, where it needs to be part of our Gelassenheit theology that the holy not only guides us away from morally problematic kinds of behavior, both individually and collectively, but also that it provides a remedy for the times in the past that we have committed these kinds of morally problematic acts, that is, sins, whether that's the individual or the society of which the individual is a part. So that's the other thing I want to do today. But first of all, let's go back to the point that I'd like to clarify from last time. Remember that in 1933, when Heidegger is sketching this Nazi philosophy, again, he's thinking about the Nazi state where the leader or the Führer throws the people or das Volk an assignment or an Auftrag, and depending on whether or not they catch it in a geschmeidig way, a skillful way, determines whether or not the leader and the people have proven worthy to possess and to exercise power. So here it seems like there is an emphasis on agency, both on the part of the leader and the people, and a kind of almost voluntaristic view that Heidegger is suggesting. Whereas later, when he's discussing the event of Erignis, or non-metaphysical being, the emphasis is upon Dasein, this sort of style of human being that's manifested in individuals and communally, standing in the clearing, sort of withstanding various challenges and hoping that there will be this advent of a radically non-metaphysical way of thinking. So here, the emphasis seems to be more on vulnerability and passivity, so that, again, rhetorically, it looks like we're dealing with two very different views. Now, against this, I objected that in the case of the view from 1933, contrary to these rhetorical differences, in fact, there very much is an element of vulnerability within the Nazi state as Heidegger is thinking about it in the Schwarze Hefte from that year, 33. Because whether the leader and the people, whether the leader throws the people an Auftrag that they catch in a skillful way is not something that is completely under their control. Yes, they have to be engaged, involved, their agency has to be engaged. They have to be there in order for a possibly skillful execution of a project to occur. They have to be trying, but their trying does not engineer or determine that. And so there's a sense in which they too are standing in the clearing, if you will, or exposed or vulnerable to things that are not completely under the control. And whether it turns out in a good way, in a skillful way or not, is not something that they can orchestrate or pull the strings about. Now, to underscore this point, I would like to go back and read one of these entries from the Schwarze Hefte in 1933. This can be found in section 21 of the 1933 entries. I think it's on page 113 in that volume. So I'm going to read it in German first, and then I will read my translation of it, my English translation of it in the book, and then I want to comment on it and show how it supports the point that I've been making. So here's what Heidegger says. Der Auftrag, keine machtlose Idee, die wir zuweilen denken, kein schwebendes Bild, das wir bislang anschauen, sondern was dem Dasein in seinem Grunde zu tragen aufgegeben ist, gleich als stehe es in einem Strom, der gegen uns heranfließt. Now, here's the English translation of that. The assignment, not a powerless idea we think every now and then, not a hovering picture that until now we look at, rather what is given to human existence in its ground to bear, just as if it stands in a stream that flows against us. Now, notice that last part, the part about gleich als stehe es, that is Dasein, in einem Strom, der gegen uns heranfließt, or in English, just as if it, that is Dasein, stands in a stream that flows against us. Now, here, there's this rhetoric that we encountered later in the entries from the Beiträge zur Philosophie in the 30s and on into the 40s from the letter on humanism. This sort of Dasein is standing, okay, not in a clearing, but in a stream. Obviously, it has to withstand the currents that are flowing around it. Its agency is engaged, but it also has to withstand that. It's exposed and vulnerable in a way that's very similar to the kind of vulnerability that Heidegger talks about later. So that rhetorically, that's true of the leader and the people in the Nazi state. Yes, they have to stand in the situation where the leader has given an Auftrag or an assignment and the people have caught it and are trying to execute it. They have to stand and withstand this challenge. Yes, their agency is engaged, but they cannot determine the outcome. They can only do the best that they can. And hopefully, Heidegger thinks, if things go well, the people will catch this assignment, execute it skillfully, and so then the leader and the people will prove themselves worthy to possess and exercise power. Now, so I think it's very clear that philosophically, the view from 1933 is basically the same as the later view. And the problem in each case is the same, because we've looked at examples where someone might, let's say there may be a leader who gives an Auftrag that the people catch, and so suppose that it's something like building extermination camps to get rid of undesirables, which they do, and they do it in a skillful way. Now, Heidegger would say, well, in that situation, the leader and the people have proven worthy to exercise and possess power. But in any ordinary sense of those terms, nothing could be further from the truth. If anything, the leader and the people have proven themselves not worthy to possess and exercise power. They've proven themselves worthy to have power stripped from them, and some of them have proven themselves worthy to be subjected to war crimes trials, to be tried as war criminals. So that's a problem with this view from 33, and the problem doesn't go away later, because we could imagine situations where, well, we are going to stand in the clearing with our agency engaged, ready to do the best that we can, knowing that we can't determine everything, but the goal might be something like this. It might be, well, we're going to stand in the clearing and exist in a way that we hope eventually the society will evolve so that we've gotten rid of all the metaphysical thinkers and all the people who are holding these views that we think are problematic or contrary or deleterious to this radically non-metaphysical way of thinking that we want to bloom and to emerge. And so we might burn books, we might, or try to at least, we might try to fire people, professors, deny them tenure or fire them if we don't like their views. These are not things that we may do all those things, and it might work and it might not, but at least we try. And if it does work out, then in that situation, I suppose Heidegger would say, well, Dasein has proven that it has withstood the storm of being and now has transitioned to this post-metaphysical way of thinking, because all the metaphysical undesirables have been eliminated in various ways. But again, what we would say here is that this is morally atrocious. We certainly want to preclude this kind of tyrannical and oppressive activity, and nothing in Heidegger's later descriptions of Ereignis precludes it. just as nothing in his earlier descriptions of it in 33 preclude that sort of problem. So that's the objection that I was trying to make last time, and I wanted to clarify that because I think it's important for us to keep it in mind. Now let's proceed to the second part of today's lecture, the second task. We've been talking about how the holy, as something that is different from, the advent of the holy as something that's different from the advent of non-metaphysical being, can serve through this sort of phenomenologically attuned decision process we described a couple of times ago. It can help to shunt us away from these kind of morally atrocious acts or these very problematic ways of behaving and direct us towards more positive ways of behaving. That was the whole point of the account of agency we gave in the last, well, that's been a couple of lectures ago, but it continued to move along with us as we proceed into these questions. But that's only one kind of need that we have. That's one need that the being, the non-metaphysical event of being, has for the holy. And remember, all the way back at the very beginning, it was part of the most promising proto-theology that we set forth, that the holy is different from the non-metaphysical event of being. The holy needs that non-metaphysical event in order to remove metaphysical obfuscations that might interfere with the proper understanding of the holy, that might confuse our thinking about the holy. But it's also the case in the third proto-theology, the most promising one, that the non-metaphysical event of being needs the holy. And we've had this promissory note all along. Well, we need to explain that. We've begun to explain it with the account of agency, because here, the sense in which the non-metaphysical event of the holy, non-metaphysical event of being needs the holy, it needs the holy to guide it in a positive direction and away from these very dangerous negative directions that we've been discussing. That's one sense in which the non-metaphysical event needs the holy. But there's another way that the Gelassenheit theologian wants to bring out, and that is the non-metaphysical event, and not just that, human behavior and culture in general, needs the holy to provide a remedy for past transgressions, not just to shunt us away from possible future ones, but to remedy and to rectify the ones and to overcome the ones that we have committed in the past, which the Christian tradition would name as sins. Now, I want to discuss how that works today, and to do that, I want to describe the way that three sinful syndromes, as I want to call them, three sinful syndromes are emblemized and focused by the crucifixion of Jesus. When Jesus dies on the cross, we can see that episode as emblematic of these three sinful syndromes that are coming to fruition. So the first one is what I would like to call metaphysical hyperobjectivity. So remember that when Heidegger is discussing metaphysical hyperobjectivity, what he has in mind is when we treat our relationship to reality as one of sort of stepping back, looking at things, and making all kinds of judgments about them. We judge things as if they were simply objects of representation. And Heidegger discusses this throughout his career. This is one of his bête noirs. This is one of his targets. Now, clearly, when Jesus is crucified, we can see that episode as emblemizing this kind of metaphysical hyperobjectivity, because we can step back and look at him suffering there on the cross and make all kinds of judgments, objective judgments about what's happening. He has a number of wounds. His physical condition is very bad at this point. He's bleeding. He's thirsty, and so forth. We can make all these judgments and treat him simply as an object, right? Remember the poetic image that we murder to dissect. Well, we could certainly look at the crucifixion in these terms, where that's Wordsworth. He uses that figure, that poetic figure. Well, we could certainly dissect Jesus sort of intellectually as he's there on the cross, dying and suffering. And then we can also eventually, when he does give up the ghost, say, well, he's dead now. That's another judgment where we're treating him as an object of representation and we're making a factual judgment about that. So we could look at the crucifixion in those terms so that this kind of metaphysical hyper-objectivity is emblemized there. But that's not the only sinful syndrome. There are two more. Another one is the very kind of non-metaphysical thinking that Heidegger wants to support or he wants to advance. So let's look at the cross itself, the cross on which Jesus dies. We can imagine that this was something that was created in a workshop and that the wood was gathered in the mountains or in a forest somewhere in the Middle East, and it was brought to Jerusalem, and then the wood was cured and treated, and there were all these tools in the workshop, and then this cross was assembled, and then it was delivered to the Roman authorities so that they could execute enemies of the state. Now, I use this workshop example deliberately because this is exactly the kind of circumspection that Heidegger discusses in Sein und Zeit when he's talking about, being Zuhanda, like tools, equipment. This is the first inkling of a kind of non-metaphysical way of thinking where, we're not making judgments. The only time that we step back and become aware of the things in the tool shop as if they were objects is when something breaks, maybe, or is missing, and then we're no longer circumspectively engaged. We're stepping back and trying to figure out what went wrong or what's missing. When we, though, are circumspectively engaged in the task of being a carpenter, or another example that Heidegger gives in Sein und Zeit is driving a car and turning on the turn signals sort of reflexively. That's a kind of non-metaphysical thinking because we're not making objective judgments. We're simply sort of seamlessly behaving in this way because we're engaged in these projects. And the point with the cross and the way the materials were gathered, the way the cross itself was constructed in Jerusalem is a way in which that kind of non-metaphysical thinking can be seamlessly integrated with a tyrannical state like the Roman state that put Jesus to death in this horrendous way. So once again, here we see how non-metaphysical thinking itself can become allied with morally dubious objectives and ends, in particular political ones here. So that it's not enough for us, contrary to what Heidegger might suggest, or some of his supporters might suggest, it's not enough for us if we want to avoid these kind of moral atrocities and this kind of cruelty and wickedness. It's not enough for us to get rid of metaphysics because non-metaphysics can be just as cruel and heartless and morally atrocious as any kind of metaphysical thinking. We see that in Jesus' crucifixion because it emblemizes this kind of non-metaphysical circumspection, this non-metaphysical thinking, no less than it emblemizes the metaphysical hyper-objectivity. So that's the second syndrome. What's the third one? Well, as we can learn from the scriptures themselves, who are the people who put Jesus to death? It wasn't just the Roman authorities. It was the traditional Jewish leaders in Jerusalem who saw Jesus as a threat. And these were very pious people. They were certainly very devout and true to the Judaism of their day, every jot and tittle of it down to the letter, but they wound up facilitating this horrendous crime where they're putting Jesus to death, who's an innocent person. He hasn't done anything wrong. He's simply preaching the gospel, but they are complicit in his death. And it's not just Judaism. Christians can be guilty of the same kind of false religiosity. People who profess to be Christians can be cruel and can cooperate with morally atrocious and dubious political objectives. So can Muslims. So can Buddhists. So can any religious person, at least if the person is professing a particular creed, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Islam or whatever it is. That doesn't preclude that same thing can happen, that the person or the people, in the case of a collective situation, can become allied to these very dubious kinds of crimes and acts or sins. So once again, false religiosity is emblemized in Jesus' crucifixion. Now, how does this provide a remedy for sin? Well, if all that happens is that Jesus is crucified and then he dies, there's no remedy, because then the forces of metaphysical hyperobjectivity, non-metaphysical circumspection or non-metaphysical thinking, and false religiosity, which are typified in the crucifixion, they will have triumphed. He's dead, and they have eliminated this enemy of the state or the enemy of the established religion. They have done that. But that's not, at least according to the Christian understanding of the gospel, that is not the end, because Jesus lives again beyond the crucifixion. Yes, he dies on the cross, but then he rises from the dead. And so remember that another aspect of Galatian high theology we discussed is that Jesus, in his life, he exemplifies the deepest possible intimacy between humanity on the one hand and the holy or divinity on the other, because he lives his entire life from the moment that he becomes an agent or has reached the age of reason, as we would say in Catholicism. But once he becomes an agent who is capable of making morally responsible judgments, he is guided by the holy. It's part of him all along, even in his birth, right? So his entire life is characterized by the deepest possible conceivable intimacy between humanity and divinity. And so when he lives again beyond the crucifixion, that shows that that intimacy is not vanquished by any of the sinful syndromes that I mentioned, whether it be metaphysical hyperobjectivity or non-metaphysical circumspection or false religiosity or any other conceivable syndrome that might be typified in the crucifixion. Those things do not have the last word. They do not triumph. Rather, he lives beyond them. And when we follow his example, or try to prayerfully, again, under the guidance of the holy, we then can try to conform our lives more to his post-resurrection existence, which is really a continuation of his ministry on earth, but an intensification of it because it draws us, or can draw us, into it deeper and deeper. So that, it seems to me, is the sense in which the Gelassenheit can say that this intimacy between the holy and the human can not only guide us away from sinning in the future, but it can also help to rectify past sins which are emblemized on the cross in these three sinful syndromes that I have described. And as an end note, I think it's important to say that when Jesus rises from the dead, yes, this is something that people might say, well, look, I can't really understand that because modern science doesn't really allow for bodies rising from the dead, or we don't have any scientific theory of that, or it doesn't make any sense from a purely naturalistic standpoint. I discuss this a bit more in my book in a bit more detail, but I would remind people that even within science, at some point you get down to things that simply happen. Yes, the sun gives light and heat because of these nuclear reactions that are taking place in the heart of the sun. And these nuclear reactions present, they, as the physicists will explain much better than I can, they give rise to processes that generate heat and light. But why those things happen, those nuclear processes, or why those things in the sun, those nuclear, those minute particles and other kinds of physical forces behave the way they do, well, they just do. There's no explanation of that. Or if something, water causes something to melt, or let's say hot water causes something to melt, well, heat has that result. Heat, when something that's frozen is exposed to heat, then it melts. That's just something that happens. And in other words, at some point in any physical explanation, one is going to reach bedrock processes and activities that simply happen the way they do. Now, that means certainly there's nothing contradictory or outrageous about the idea that there's, under certain conditions, human bodies might behave just the way they do. It might just happen that a body that has died comes back to life. I don't know there's no scientific explanation for that, but there's also no scientific explanation for everything that happens in the material universe. At some point, you're going to have to reach the point where things simply happen the way they do. Whether we're talking about chain reactions in the sun, or we're talking about how heat melts snow, or we're talking perhaps, as the scriptures describe, how Jesus rises from the dead, and how we might do so one day too. So all I'm saying here is I'm not trying to prove that resurrection is a scientific fact. I'm simply suggesting that we shouldn't let our respect for science blind us to that possibility. And once we take that possibility seriously, then we can see in the context of this Gelassenheit theology that we are developing how the holy can provide a remedy for past sins, in addition to providing a stimulus to goad us or guide us away from committing other sins, and that finally gives us the deepest sense in which the non-metaphysical event of being also needs the holy. Why only a God can save us. So on that note, I would like to conclude today's lecture. Next time, I will probably be looking at some applications of this. I need to consider where exactly I want to go with the remaining lectures. We're almost at the end of this particular project. But until then, I hope that this discussion has been informative for you. Again, I always welcome your questions and comments. I would like to have some more participation here because I think that this is not the only way of doing theology. It has never been my intent to say that, but I think it's a useful way of doing it, especially today. We need more tools in the toolbox, and I am trying to provide us with that. So please consider that. Please take that to heart. Until next time, this is Dr. Peter Dillard signing off for Black Cat Theology.